A seasoned captain tried to step off his ship like nothing was wrong until a police dog stood in his way, then turned and locked eyes with something no one else saw. What happened next had federal agents scrambling. But before we get into it, drop your favorite dog's name in the comments and tap that subscribe button, because if you think this was intense, wait till you see what's coming next. The Pacific sky blushed with the first light of dawn as Port Everglades slowly woke from its fitful sleep. Containers stacked like towering steel blocks lined the docks, their shadows stretching long and cold over the concrete. Cranes groaned, seagulls wheeled overhead, and the air buzzed with the scent of salt water, machine oil, and something else, something buried deep. Among the movement of men and machinery, one pair stood out. Officer Neil Archer walked with measured strides down Pier 7, his K9 partner Bruno padding silently beside him. Bruno was a powerful Belgian Malinois, his tan coat marked with a black saddle and a face sharpened by years of training. His nose twitched with every shift of the wind, ears tuned like radar dishes, eyes scanning everything with silent intelligence. Neil and Bruno had worked ports up and down the coast for nearly 3 years now, and while many days blurred into routine inspections and quiet paperwork, today felt different. There was no sign, no official warning, just a sensation, a tug at the gut. The kind of feeling a veteran officer trusted more than a dozen reports. The SS Verona, a mid-sized container vessel registered out of Malta, was scheduled for a routine cargo and crew inspection. Nothing unusual on the manifest: machinery, textiles, dry goods. Its captain, Leonard Voss, had cleared customs several times in the past 6 months without incident. No red flags, no alerts. Just another vessel and a long line of ships moving quietly between the shadows of global trade. As Neil approached the docking point, he nodded to the harbor master, who was busy coordinating cranes offloading from a nearby vessel. "Verona's early," the man said without looking up from his tablet. "Tied up 30 minutes ago. Customs is standing by." Neil gave a short nod, his eyes drifting toward the ship. From this angle it looked like all the others, functional, anonymous, and forgettable. But Bruno's posture had changed. He was still, ears forward, his breathing shallow. The leash tugged just slightly. Neil didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both felt it. At the foot of the gangway, 2 customs officers waited with clipboards in hand. One of them gestured to the ship. "Crew's mostly inside. Captain's finishing up the manifest. Should be quick." Neil checked Bruno's harness and gave a small hand signal. The dog moved forward, controlled but alert. The ship's deck creaked beneath their boots. Metal groaned softly in the morning breeze. Bruno sniffed along the entryway, his head lowering, shoulders tightening. Neil noticed it immediately. The shift in body language was subtle but unmistakable. He had seen it enough times to know something wasn't right. They moved through the lower levels first: crew quarters, galley, control room. Nothing triggered a formal alert, but Bruno was uneasy. His tail was rigid, his steps deliberate. At every turn he paused, sniffed, and moved on with hesitation. The captain finally emerged from his quarters near the bridge. He was tall, clean-shaven, with pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough. "Officer," he said, extending a hand. "Captain Leonard Voss. Welcome aboard." Neil returned the gesture but watched Bruno out of the corner of his eye. The dog wasn't focused on the captain yet. Instead, he paced near the main hallway, sniffing the air like something had just shifted. "Standard inspection today," Neil said. "We will be thorough, but we will keep it smooth. I assume you have prepared the documents?" "Of course," the captain replied. "Manifest, crew list, export permits. Everything is in my office. We have got nothing to hide." Neil nodded. "We'll start with the manifest." As they entered the captain's quarters, Bruno remained outside, his gaze now fixed toward the cargo hold's lower access. Neil watched this closely. Bruno was trained to respond to scent changes with layers of behavior. Vexation without physical alert often meant something human-related, fear, intent, or concealment. Neil took the manifest folder and scanned it quickly. It all looked in order, proper stamps, familiar routes, plausible contents, but Bruno hadn't moved from the hallway. His body was turned away from the room, fixated on something deeper in the ship. They exited, returning to the main deck. A few crew members passed by, most offering polite nods. One avoided eye contact, disappearing quickly below deck. Bruno tracked him with his nose but didn't follow. Instead, he led Neil toward the forward cargo bay entrance. Neil paused. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. Though Bruno wouldn't answer, he simply stepped closer to the cargo access, placed his paws firmly at the threshold, and sat rigid and still. That was the sign. Neil radioed it in. 15 minutes later, Officer Tamara Fields and her team joined them at the cargo entrance. They were assigned to contraband inspection, equipment ready, scanners humming, trained hands steady. "Bruno signaled?" Tamara asked. "He's not giving us a full narcotics alert," Neil replied. "But he's tracking something, strong enough to dig." Bruno led the group down into the cargo deck. Row after row of containers stretched before them, steel giants bolted to the hull. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and heat. Bruno moved carefully, nose low, stopping periodically, sniffing the joints between containers. Then he halted, mid-row, near a large green crate labeled Pneumatic Cylinders, Turin, Italy. Neil stepped forward and opened the latch. Inside, layers of thick foam cradled what looked like legitimate industrial parts. Bruno pressed in, sniffing deep into the foam, his breathing suddenly heavy. Then, for the first time, he gave the unmistakable sign, head low, eyes focused, tail stiff, before sitting back with a single short bark. Tamara moved in. "Get the scanning tools," she said. As they began probing deeper, something scraped across the floor above. Neil's eyes narrowed. "Upper deck?" Bruno growled softly. "Just once." Neil and Tamara exchanged glances. Someone was moving. Someone was watching. Above deck, Captain Voss was standing near the starboard railing, speaking with a man in a long gray coat, someone who hadn't appeared on any of the paperwork. Neil climbed the stairwell slowly, Bruno at his heel. "Captain," he called. "Need a word." The captain turned too quickly. The man beside him disappeared below deck in a flash, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Neil didn't chase. Not yet. Instead, he kept walking forward until Bruno stopped. The dog's head turned, eyes following the fleeing man's path like radar. "Who was that?" Neil asked. "A surveyor," Voss replied calmly. "Port services. Probably logged somewhere. He is not on any of your lists." "Well, we just docked. Could be the harbor's paperwork hasn't caught up." Neil didn't reply. He looked down at Bruno, who was watching the stairwell like it was alive. "Is there something you're not telling us, Captain?" Voss folded his arms. "Officer, this is a standard cargo ship. If there's an issue, I'll cooperate. But I won't tolerate being accused without cause." Neil's radio buzzed. It was Tamara. Her voice was tense. "You need to get down here." The crate had a false bottom. "We found something." Back in the hold, Tamara held up a sealed pouch, clear plastic, packed tightly with thin sheets of synthetic film. "Fentanyl precursors," she said. "This crate's part of a multi-stage masking technique. Only someone with chemical training could recognize the blend." Neil looked back toward the stairwell. Bruno's ears were pinned now. He gave a low growl, not of aggression but focused attention. Someone was still on board, someone who knew exactly what they were trying to hide. "We need to search the rest of the crew," Neil said, "and verify every container marked for customs release." Bruno led the way. passing quickly through narrow corridors and down a second stairwell. As they reached the rear access point, the dog suddenly stopped and barked once sharply. Someone was trying to leave. At the gangway, just as the ship's rear line was being adjusted, Captain Voss approached calmly at first, walking with measured steps as if to oversee the mooring. But as he neared the ramp, Bruno moved ahead, silent, swift, and firm. He stopped directly in the captain's path, blocking the way with his body. Voss froze. Neil shouted from behind, "Stand down, do not move." The captain turned, and for the first time Neil saw it. Not panic, not defiance, but resignation. The captain looked down at the dog before him, then slowly turned around, facing Neil, arms raised. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said. Neil didn't need to. He trusted Bruno. The scene froze for a breathless moment. Captain Voss standing at the edge of the gangway, arms raised, his path blocked by the silent presence of Bruno. The tension in the air seemed to throb, every sound on the dock muted beneath the weight of what had just happened. Bruno remained locked in place, muscles coiled like springs. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stared, an immovable sentinel holding a man of command in place without uttering a single sound. That kind of obedience, that depth of understanding, didn't come from training alone. It came from a bond earned through time and fire. Neil approached slowly, hand resting near his service belt, not out of fear but from reflex. He could see it in Voss's face now, the layers peeling back. The calm exterior was cracking, a lot fear of being caught with something, but fear of what might come next. Fear of who might be watching. "You tried to slip away," Neil said. "Why?" Voss didn't respond. His gaze dropped to Bruno again before he slowly raised both hands higher in a quiet admission of something he wasn't ready to say out loud. Neil signaled the customs officers, "Escort the captain to the main cabin and hold him under watch." No communication with the crew, no radio, no phone. As Voss was led away, Bruno turned and looked up at Neil, eyes calm but alert. Something deeper was unraveling on this ship, and Bruno had sensed it before any of them did. Back in the cargo hold, the search intensified. Officer Tamara Fields had unearthed another concealed section in a separate container, this one labeled as agricultural equipment bound for a distribution center in Arizona. But the steel casing inside told a different story. With the help of thermal imaging equipment, they discovered a false wall behind which several cylindrical tanks were nestled, each filled with a chemical compound whose labeling had been deliberately obscured. "What is it?" Neil asked as he watched the testing kit shift colors. "Industrial-grade solvent," Tamara said, "one used in synthetic drug labs. This much of it? Someone's planning large-scale production stateside." Neil scanned the container serials, matching them against the manifest. Several numbers had been altered with near-perfect precision, digits surgically changed to correspond with legal shipment entries. "This took time," Neil said. "They have been prepping this route for months." The man in the gray coat who had vanished earlier hadn't resurfaced. A full crew count revealed he wasn't listed among the personnel, nor was he registered with the port. Surveillance footage at the dock entrance showed him boarding the Verona 2 hours prior to its arrival, carrying nothing, blending in with cargo workers. And now he was missing. Neil reviewed the ship's internal security cameras, but large sections of footage had been erased or never recorded. The few functioning feeds showed the man slipping through the lower maintenance corridors, areas normally restricted to engineering staff. "He knew the layout," Tamara muttered. "He's been here before." Bruno led Neil through those same maintenance corridors now, nose close to the metal grating, navigating a path that seemed random at first, but then began to follow a rhythm. Every so often he paused, sniffed the air, then pressed forward again, leading Neil deeper into the heart of the ship. They reached a small locked door near the engineering shaft. The maintenance log said it was a spare parts storage, but the padlock was new, industrial grade, and the hinges bore signs of fresh welding. Neil stepped back and gave the nod. A marine technician was called in to breach the lock. Inside, the space was no wider than a janitor's closet. But what it held didn't belong on a commercial vessel. There was a small metal workstation, faint chemical residue on the surface, an empty duffel bag marked with customs insignia from multiple countries, a notebook filled with hand-drawn shipping routes that mapped out not just Verona's journey, but multiple other ships across 3 continents. At the center was a single photo, pinned to the wall with a rusted clip. It showed Captain Voss standing beside 2 men, one of them the mystery figure in the gray coat. Neil stared at the image, then turned to Bruno, who was scanning the tiny room with laser focus. This wasn't just a smuggling job, Neil muttered. This was coordination, organized, layered, protected. And they have done this before. Outside the room, the crew's demeanor had shifted. They moved less, spoke even less. Word of the captain's detainment had spread, and the absence of their shadowy guest hadn't gone unnoticed. Neil and Tamara interviewed several of them. Some offered rehearsed phrases about routine delivery and tight deadlines. Others, more nervous, gave small signs, hesitant glances, sudden silence at the mention of chemical tanks. None said anything outright, but Bruno's presence changed the room every time he entered. Eyes dropped, postures stiffened, truths began to squirm beneath the surface. One crew member, an older mechanic named Pavel, finally cracked. He didn't speak, but handed over a torn sheet from a logbook. On it, times and initials were listed, midnight entries marked 3 days prior to arrival, all led back to one container. Container 11D, unscanned, unopened, missing from the manifest entirely. As they approached the container, Bruno slowed again. He sniffed once, paused, then pressed his body low to the floor. His breathing changed, sharper now, tense. This wasn't a scent of chemicals. It was something else. Neil moved forward slowly and tapped the side of the container. A faint echo responded, wrong for a container supposed to be filled with machinery. They breached the seal and pulled the doors wide. Inside, huddled in the far corner behind tarps and boxed parts, were 3 people, 2 adults, 1 child. Eyes wide, thin, silent, smuggled, hidden. They weren't crew, they weren't cargo, they were human. Tamara moved in first, lowering her voice and her body to their level. The adults spoke quietly, in broken English. The girl didn't speak at all, just stared at Bruno with a look that was hard to name. Not fear, something more fragile, like hope trying to breathe through exhaustion. Neil knelt down beside her. Bruno stepped forward, his stance loose, non-threatening. The girl reached out and placed her hand on the dog's head. He didn't move. Just let her touch him, and for the first time since they opened the container, she exhaled. "We were told it was safe," one of the adults whispered. "He said we would arrive and be taken to the border, clean papers, work, safety." "Who's he?" Neil asked. "The man in the coat," the woman said. "He met us in Varna, paid him everything." They were victims, trafficked, discarded, nearly forgotten. Had Bruno not fixated on this corner of the ship, they may never have been found. Neil stood up and stared down the narrow corridor, jaw tight. Captain Voss hadn't just been moving chemicals, he had been moving people. With the ship now in full lockdown, federal authorities arrived. Neil briefed them alongside Tamara, laying out the evidence, the hidden compartments, the modified manifest, the crew's complicity, and the human cargo. But the biggest piece still dangled out of reach. The man in the gray coat, a ghost on the dock. Customs had no record. Port entry footage showed him slipping past the checkpoint without ID. By the time federal agents traced the movements, the trail had gone cold, swallowed into the labyrinth of warehouses that spread like veins around the harbor. Back in the ship's holding area, Captain Voss sat under guard, no longer defiant, no longer proud. Neil entered with Bruno and placed the photo on the table. "Who is he?" Neil asked. Voss stared at the image for a long moment. His hands trembled slightly, not from guilt, but fear. "I never knew his name," he said quietly. "He just appeared one day and then another. He threatened to hurt my family if I didn't do what he asked. You moved people for him. I didn't know at first. They said it was just relocation, refugees. Then the crates changed. The chemicals, the girl," his voice cracked. "I tried to back out. He said if I didn't finish this trip, they will kill my wife." Neil didn't flinch. He had heard excuses before, but this one carried the weight of someone trapped too deep for rescue, and yet it didn't absolve him. Not from silence, not from participation. Later that evening, Neil sat on the dock with Bruno. The sun had dropped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The ship was lit from within now, every container under scrutiny, every name logged, every movement tracked. Bruno lay beside him, head resting on his paws, eyes alert even in rest. "You knew from the start," Neil said quietly. "Didn't trust the air, the silence. You read the fear before we ever saw it." Bruno turned his head slightly, not to answer, just to be near. They had pulled 3 lives from the shadows today, stopped an entire network in motion, and it had started with a dog blocking a captain at the gangway, and it wasn't over. Not yet. The night air along Port Everglade had a strange stillness to it, one not born from peace, but from anticipation. Lights cast long shadows over the Verona's hull, flickering across the dock like restless ghosts of the day's discoveries. But Neil wasn't resting. Neither was Bruno. A makeshift command center had been set up inside a Port Authority trailer, its walls papered with documents, container diagrams, shipping manifests, and grainy surveillance stills. Tamara stood at a whiteboard, piecing together the movements of the ship, its cargo, its crew, and most pressingly, the unknown man in the gray coat. The man who had slipped aboard unnoticed. The man who had walked with the captain like an equal. The man who had vanished before the first container was opened. There was no passport, no fingerprints, no ID, only a trail of uncertainty. But Neil had one thing the man hadn't counted on: Bruno. The agents from Homeland Security and DEA wanted to push forward with protocol, track manifests, seize physical evidence, run chemical tests, all essential work. But Neil knew this network didn't run on paper alone. It ran on instinct, on fear, on silence. So he went back to the crew. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He brought Bruno. The silent weight of the dog's presence, his stillness, his stare was enough to loosen something in those who had kept quiet. By midnight, 2 more crewmen had admitted to seeing the man on previous voyages. They described him as punctual, detached, and always watching. He never spoke unless necessary. He carried a sealed briefcase every time. He never used the radio. He never left fingerprints. One name finally slipped out, half-whispered, more rumor than fact. They called him Mikhail. No last name, no address. Just a name passed from port to port, ship to ship, like a warning etched into steel. Neil took that name and worked backwards. He dug through old logs from past inspections, 2 years of shipping data. Every time Captain Voss's vessel had entered a U.S. port, it had been alongside another carrier. Different names, different routes, but always within the same 36-hour window. Bruno lay nearby, resting his head on his paws, tracking Neil's every motion with those bright, intelligent eyes. "You're piecing it together too, aren't you?" Neil muttered. And then a connection clicked. A secondary freighter, the Andiva Star, was docked just 600 yards across the bay, registered out of Cyprus. Inspected 2 days ago, cleared with minor infractions. Neil pulled the satellite check-in logs. No anomalies, but Bruno was already standing up. At 2:17 a.m., Neil and Bruno walked the length of Dock 11 under quiet skies. The Andiva Star loomed ahead, its lights dimmed, cargo long unloaded. No crew visible. The watchman on duty raised an eyebrow. "Problem?" he asked. "Just follow-up checks," Neil said. "Routine." Middle of the night? Neil glanced at Bruno. The dog was staring at the gangway. "I don't make the schedules." They boarded without incident. The crew logs had just 9 names, all accounted for. But Neil didn't need a list. He had Bruno. The dog moved through the tight corridors like a shadow, nose to floor, back tense, breathing slow. Every so often he stopped, sniffed hard, then moved again. In the starboard corridor leading toward the engine room, he halted completely. One bark, one sharp, clear, authoritative bark. Neil knocked twice on the door ahead. No answer. He opened it slowly. Empty. Just a crew bunk, or so it seemed. Bruno stepped forward and pressed his snout beneath one of the bed's side panels. There was a soft creak. The edge lifted, an unlatched compartment. Inside was a briefcase. They didn't open it there. Instead, Neil carefully carried it back to the port command post. Forensics took over. It wasn't wired. No explosives, just contents packed with cold precision, laminated ledgers, chemical breakdowns, crypto wallet access codes, and one photo. It was the girl from the Verona. Not from yesterday, but from over a year ago. Different clothing, different background, same eyes, same face. She had been in this cycle longer than anyone realized. By sunrise, an Interpol match came through. The man in the coat, Mikhail Antonov, former logistics officer in a disbanded Eastern Bloc intelligence agency, hadn't been seen in any official capacity in over 7 years, now connected to 8 known cargo vessels, 6 human trafficking investigations, and an international synthetic drug ring moving across 3 continents. He had eluded every net, until now. The federal team launched an international alert. Every ship flagged with known route overlaps was grounded for inspection. Customs agencies across ports in Rotterdam, Izmir, Montreal, and Buenos Aires went into immediate lockdown. The ripple effect was massive. But it wasn't just paper and raids that made it possible. It was one dog, one moment, one block at the gangway. Neil stood once again on the Verona's deck, watching as the last of the containers were unloaded under tight security. The ship would remain docked under federal seizure until the full investigation concluded. He stepped into the storage bay where they had found the girl and her family. The corner was empty now, cleared out, clean, stripped of its horror, but Bruno still moved slowly across the space, nose to floor, head low. He sniffed, paused, then looked up at Neil with eyes that spoke volumes. "You remember," Neil said. "Don't you?" Bruno sat beside the spot, ears forward, posture composed. "You don't forget them." Neil reached down and stroked the side of his partner's neck. "Neither do I." Later that afternoon, Neil visited the processing center where the rescued family was being temporarily housed. The girl sat on a folding bench, her back straight, hands in her lap. She didn't speak when Neil approached, but when she saw Bruno, her eyes changed. The dog approached slowly. He didn't wag. He didn't nuzzle. He simply walked up and sat beside her, just as he had the night before. She leaned over, pressed her forehead gently to the side of his head, and let out a breath. Bruno stayed with her like that until she fell asleep, her hand wrapped loosely around his collar. The captain had been transferred to federal custody. His cooperation, while substantial, didn't erase his involvement. But his confession and the data found in the briefcase led to the dismantling of the trafficking ring's western corridor. A week later, the Department of Homeland Security issued a formal commendation to the Port Everglade K-9 unit. Neil refused the ceremony. Instead, he took Bruno to their usual stretch of empty dock, a cracked pier that jutted into the bay like an arm reaching for peace. He tossed the worn green tennis ball, Bruno's favorite, and watched the dog sprint after it, every muscle moving with joyful purpose. When Bruno returned, Neil knelt beside him. "You didn't just stop a man from running," he said softly. "You stopped a machine. You saved them." Bruno dropped the ball at his feet, ready for the next one. Weeks passed. The Verona was stripped, examined, and finally sold to a foreign shipping firm. But the story of that inspection traveled far, not because of headlines, but because of one moment, one dog, standing firm when others would have looked away. It reminded those who listened that sometimes the smallest act, a silent refusal to step aside, could change the course of many lives. And for one girl, one family, and dozens of others they would never meet, that quiet act of courage meant everything. If that story left you speechless, imagine what we're sharing next. These real-life rescues will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss out. Hit like, tap subscribe, and join us for the next unbelievable journey. You'll never look at police dogs the same way again.